My name is Noel Fleming. Um, I started work on the 2nd of September 1963 in Thomas Street in the Liberties, and it's now the 4th of May or the 5th of May 2020, and I've been working down there all my life ever since. How I came to start there is a story in itself. I finished in primary school when I was 11 years of age, and I had skipped a couple of classes because I was supposed to be too bright for the classes I was in, and I was too young to go to Emmett Road Tech in Inchicore, which is where I wanted to go to learn a trade because my father and all my uncles were all tradesmen. They all served their time in the railway in Inchicore, which was a wonderful place that gave so much employment to the people in the ranch where I was born. When the Great Southern Railways were built in Inchicore, at their peak they must have employed maybe 3,000 people. Practically everybody in the ranch, which was started off with one row of houses. There was 16 houses. Then they built at right angles to it First Avenue, and then at the other end of the road at right angles to that they built St Mary's Avenue. I think St Mary's Avenue may have been built first, and at the back of that, to complete the square, they built Phoenix Street. Now on St Mary's Terrace, which was the first row to be built, the first row of houses, that was built for the engine drivers in the railway. My great grandfather, Isaac Leonard, lived in the little cottage opposite where the ranch was built, and he went to work in the railway. He was a foreman in the railway. I'm not exactly sure what he'd done in the railway, but he came to live in number 14 St Mary's Terrace, and his daughter Elizabeth married my grandfather, who also lived in the ranch, and he married my grandmother, and he was working in the railway as well. He was a foreman in the patron shop. He was a patron maker. So all our families, all their children all went to work on the railway. They had 6 or 7 sons who all served their time to be fitters in the railway, and they all ended up married and went their own ways after that. But anyway, I was born and reared there. It was a wonderful place to be born and reared in. I'll tell you about that some other time. But I went to the model school in Inchicore, and as I said, I skipped a couple of classes, and I ended up doing my primary when I was 11. So I was too young to go to tech. You had to be 13. So I went to James Street Secondary. Now, while I loved learning, always loved learning, still do to this day, I never missed a day out of primary school that I can remember. But in secondary, I saw an awful lot of boys in my class. The brothers used to beat them if they didn't know subjects or if they were in late or whatever. I wasn't mad about the secondary, but I stuck it for about a year and a half, and when I was 13, it came time for an exam to get into Emmett Road Tech in Inchicore to happen. That would have been in July or August of 1963. And my mother at the time was a woman, a widow, who was left with 7 children ranging in age from 6 months to 12 years. My father was killed in an accident in his work in 1955, and my mother had to go out to work, and she worked in the gas. My father, was killed in the gas company, and my mother went to work in the gas company as a cleaner. And she used to leave our house at 6:30 in the morning, and she would work till 9 in the morning. Then she would come home, do all the housework, and you can only imagine what, after 7 children, what was needed to be done. And then she would be gone at about 4 o'clock in the evening to be in for 5:30, or maybe 4:30 to be in for 5:30, and she wouldn't be home till about 9:30 in the evening. And then she'd be met at the door with 7 screaming children saying, he done this to me, she done that to me, and all the rest of it. I don't know how the woman stuck it. But anyway, she was a wonderful woman in her own way. But very, very stressed out from the stress of working and trying to manage the household and all that. And it's not that she didn't have help or was offered help, but she was born and reared in Queen Square, which is now Pearse Square, down off Pearse Street in number 46. And the back garden of their house, it was a tenement house, there was several families living in it. The back garden, the gate into the back garden was on Mackin Street. And just across the road from the entrance to their garden was the entrance into the gasworks. And she went to work there as a young girl, and that's where she met my father. He was a fitter in the gas company. Anyway, they married, and she came up to live in the ranch. Initially, when they were married, they got a room from a relation of my father's, people called Quinn, who lived in Crumlin. They lived in a room in their house for a while. Then half a house became available in the ranch, and they came to live there. And my mother, although she got on well with her in-laws, her sisters-in-law and brothers-in-law, she didn't get on too well with her mother-in-law, because my father was the apple of her eye, and nothing my mother ever done was good enough for her. And they had a row one day over. She chastised my eldest brother in front of her mother-in-law, and she didn't like that. So after that, my mother just wouldn't have anything to do with them. But after my father was killed, some of our aunts, who were wonderful, wonderful women, did help my mother out, but she was always a very independent person. Anyway, she went to work in the gas company when my father was killed, and as I said, she would go into work in the morning, she'd come home, do all her housework, do all the washing, then she would get our dinners ready, and we'd be home at about 1:15 from school. After running home from the model school into the house, we'd have our dinner, and we'd be gone back dinnerette and gone back into school again. I think it was for 1:45 or 2:00. The school was about 3/4 of a mile from the house, so we ran home and ran back, and by the time we get back into the school, we'd be starving. Anyway, when it came time to do this examination to get into Emmet Road Tech, I made up my mind I was going to do it. And the exam was on a Saturday, and knowing my mother wouldn't be home till 9:30 or 10 on the Friday, I left her a note. And on the note it says, Ma, I don't care what you say, I'm going down to do the exam in Emmet Road Tech tomorrow. Next thing I knew, I had this pain in my head. I jumped up. My mother was standing at the end of the bed and said, listen to me, you little bastard. She had thrown the alarm clock at me. I was asleep. She threw the alarm clock. As I said, she was stressed out, and this to her was like the last straw, because I had been tormenting her about going to do this exam. And she threw the clock at me in a fit, a fit of temper. And she said, listen to me, you little bastard, you're not going near any tech. If you're leaving this house to go anywhere, it's to get a job. So I didn't do the exam the next morning. I was very disappointed. And at this stage, I was home from school. I wasn't going to school. I had finished the secondary. The following Thursday, she came home from after doing her shopping in Thomas Street and said, there's a job advertised in the window of a shop, Arthur's in Thomas Street, and you need to go down and do the entrance exam, or to go down and put your name down for the job. So I said, that's great. I hopped on my bike and I cycled into Thomas Street, and I'm jumping the gun here. It wasn't on the Thursday. On the Friday, I went down to the school, to the headmaster in the model school. Mr. Brown was his name. And I asked him for a reference to bring into the shop with me. And he wrote out a beautiful reference. I might have it somewhere in the house, and if I ever find it, it'll be worth showing to you because it was a lovely reference. And his words to me when he handed it to me was, I hope this is not some dead end job you're going into, he said, because you're better than that. And I said, thanks very much, Mr. Brown. I'm sure it'll be great. So on the Friday then I went down to the shop in Thomas Street, Artist shop, and I walked in the door and I didn't know anything about the shop or anything, what it done, what it didn't do, who was in charge of it or whatever. But I saw this man behind the counter who I took to be the boss. It turned out he wasn't the boss. His name was Christy. We became lifelong friends after it. I said, I'm here to answer the ad for the job. And he said, yes. He says, do you have a reference? And I said, I have. And I handed him the reference and he read it. He said, that's grand. He said, the boss himself will be back to work on Monday. And he says, as far as I'm concerned, you have the job. But he said, we'll have to run it by him. Now, I did not know the dynamics of the shop and the way things worked in the shop until I met Arthur. And it was something unbelievable now, to say the least. But I found out afterwards Arthur had opened the shop a few years before, was doing very well in it. And he got Christy to go and work from, the two of them worked in the home and colonial shops, which were all over Europe at the time, and they'd loads of branches all over Ireland. And both Christy and Arthur worked in the home and colonial shops. And Arthur, through his own initiative or whatever, anyway, got the money together to open his own shop. And he knew Christy was a top class baking man. Arthur's specialty was cakes and biscuits and groceries, and he was a fantastic salesman. Never met anybody before or since like him. So he got Christy to go and work for him with the promise that he would make Christy a partner at some point in the future. Now, this was about 5 years before I went to work there. And in that time, he hadn't made him a partner. And as I discovered from working with the two of them, the reason was pure and simple. He was terrified of Christy. Christy could be, domineering is the wrong word, but strong-minded. And while Arthur was one of the most wonderful men you could ever meet, a really great crack, and to him, working and living was like being on the stage. You were performing all the time. You were playing roles all the time, but you were performing. And once he was in the shop, that was like him being on the Royal. And where Christy was everything done by the letter of the law, and everything had to be neat and tidy and in its place, Arthur was one of the sloppiest people to work with you ever met. I can honestly say the sloppiest. I never met anybody like him, but great crack. So I went home anyway and told my mother that I had the job. As far as I knew, I had to go back in on Monday morning early. I had to be in for 7:30. So Monday morning rolled around. It was the 2nd of September 1963. I never forget the day. And I went to work. I came into the shop. Christy arrived down on his bike. I arrived on my bike. And another lad called Hughie from Finglas. Hughie and I became best friends as well. Up to the day he died, we were best friends. And he's dead now about 3 years. So the two of them welcomed me into the shop. And when the door was opened, they had left the shop on Saturday night, spotless. The floor was full of sawdust, so the first thing that hit me was the smell of sawdust. And the other distinct smell was tea, because one of the things that all shops in those days sold lots of was tea. And you might have had 4 or 5 different brands of tea, but that's what most people drank. If they couldn't afford a drink, they could always afford a cup of tea. So about 8 o'clock, Arthur arrived in, and he had a beautiful old Austin Cambridge estate car. No, I'm telling a lie, it wasn't an estate car. It was an estate car, it was. A maroon coloured estate car, and he pulled up in it, and he got out of the car, and he was quite like in stature Ronnie Corbett. He might have been a little bit taller than Ronnie Corbett, but he was the same shape, the same size to look at Ronnie Corbett. And he had a fabulous set of teeth and a big smile. And now Christy must have said to him before Arthur went, he was gone, he had been away on holidays, that he was going to employ a boy to be the messenger boy or to help out in the shop. So Arthur, again I found out after, was afraid of his life to say anything else. Says, right, go ahead. So Arthur came into the shop, I was introduced to him. He shook hands with me. He says, welcome over, Mr. Wonderful. I hadn't a clue what this was all about, but anyway, he says, you're going to be helping me, he says, and you're going to be helping Christy, and you're going to be helping Hughie. So Hughie and Christy were the bacon men of the shop. We sold, the biggest selling thing in the shop was the bacon. We also sold chickens, and tons of cake and tons of biscuits, and other assorted groceries. But Arthur said, now you're going to be working with me this morning, and I'll show you what to do and what not to do. So we were there. Anyway, he had a lovely suit on him, a lovely three-piece suit, and a white shirt. And as he's talking to me, he's taking the jacket off, he's taking off his waistcoat, he took off his shirt. And I was looking at him in amazement because I'd never seen anybody do anything like this before. So he went in around the counter and he came back out with a little box, and there was a polish tin in it, a tin of polish. He'd lovely brown brogues on him. The suit was a brown pinstripe suit, and he'd lovely brown brogues on him, and he proceeded to, with a small brush, to polish his brown brogues. And then with the shirt he'd taken off his back, he shined the shoes with it. And I had never seen anybody do anything like this in my life before. What I was thinking in my head was, if I'd done that, my mother would kill me. So he threw the shirt on the floor then, and he says, come on now. He had his vest on and just his trousers and his socks. And we went into the back. There was a little stores at the back of the shop, and we gathered up all the dirty coats. These would have been shop coats and aprons that we wore in the shop at the time. Brought them out into the shop. Now he says, put one of them coats on the floor, put everything else into that coat and fold it up like a parcel. So I done that. It was handy enough. I put a side of the coat around one arm and tied it, and a side of the coat around the other arm and tied it, and it made a parcel. He said, that's great. So with that, a laundry van pulled up outside the shop from the Swastika laundry, with the big swastika on the side of it. And they knew Arthur and Christy and Hughie very well because they were all on first name terms. So they brought in this parcel of coats and shirts belonging to Arthur. And he took out a lovely fresh, crisp white shirt and put it on, and put his suit back on, put on a shop coat over it and an apron on over that, and gave me a white coat to put on me, which was nearly down to my ankles. I was 13. And Christy, they got their clean coats, Christy and Hughie. So he brought me in around the counter, and on the counter, propped up by two biscuit tins, was a tray, the length of a breadboard, a present day breadboard that had been cut in half, and the wood from the side of it was attached to the half a breadboard. So it made up, if you like, a half a breadboard, but it looked like a breadboard. And this was covered with oilcloth, which was, people used to cover the tables with at the time. And he says, come on now and I'll show you how we do the mixed biscuits. So out the back there was about 20 or 30 different tins of biscuits, lovely chocolate biscuits, and every kind of biscuit you could think of was out there in that. And we brought them out, and he took out handfuls of biscuits, threw them onto the tray and mixed them up and mixed them up and mixed them up. And then there was lovely chocolate biscuits wrapped in silver paper, and these went into the top of the mix to make it really fancy looking. And he put it up on the two biscuit tins, and it was tilted at an angle, 45-degree angle, towards the glass on the counter. Now he says, go out there and tell me what you think of that. So I went out and I said, it looked great, which it did, it looked terrific. Now he says, you're not to eat any of them biscuits. He says, till you're having a cup of tea. So that was grand. So now he says, you have to come out here now. I'm going to show you what we do out the back. So in the meantime, Christy and Hughie had taken trays of bacon and rashers and sausages and stuff out of the fridge and put them into the window. Now at this time, there was no such a thing as a refrigerated window. Everything was on marble. Now, the marble was cold all the time, so trays of stuff were put into the window like this. And I was watching between looking at them doing that and looking at art. I was fascinated with all this. To a child, I was a very naive, innocent little boy at the time. I was fascinated with it. So then Arthur brought me out the back to the stores, and in the stores were all these tins of biscuits, as I said. To the left of the biscuits there was a bench. It would have measured about 6 or 7 feet by about, not quite 4 feet, but certainly 3.5 feet, and it was covered with a marble slab. And on one end of it there was a big Berkel slicer, a huge big red Berkel slicer for slicing rashers. And this was Christie's pride and joy. Nobody could touch this machine other than Christie or Hughie. Hughie was, Christie would be, say, the foreman in the shop. Hughie would be next to him. So they could touch the machine. I wasn't allowed to touch it for months. So there was a pillar in the middle of this room supporting the floor over it. And just in to the right of the pillar was a gas cooker, a fairly big gas cooker, and there was 2 huge big pots on it. 2 of them were sitting over, or one of them was sitting over 2 jets of the cooker, and the other pot was sitting over the other jets of the cooker. So he says, go out to the shop now, and in the shop there were there was a big display of vegetables up near the shop door. And he says, if any of them feel soft, bring them down to me. Or he says, they might look rotten, bring them down to me. There were onions, say, that were sprouting, there was like scallions growing out of them. So I gathered up a few of them and brought them down. Now he says, you need more than that. And he says, look in the sack that has the potatoes, if any of them have stalks on them, bring them down to me. And then he sent me out for any eggs that were cracked. Now there was trays of eggs all over the place, the way they used to come. You'd put 6 in a bag and give them to somebody, or 1 in the bag and give it to somebody, but the tray came in, or there would be cracked eggs on them, so I had to gather up all the cracked eggs and bring them out to him. And the last thing he sent me for was, there was boxes of tomatoes on the counter. He says, see if any of them are bruised, or he says, they might have a little bit of mould. He says, they're grand, bring them out to me. So I brought them out to him, and there was a little table beside the cooker, and he took one of the pots down, we brought it over, there was a sink there as well, and he half filled it with water. And then he proceeded to cut the mouldy bits off the tomatoes, and they went into the pot. The cracked eggs were cracked into the pot. Carrots, onions, all the dodgy bits were cut off them, everything thrown into the pots. Now he says, that's our stock. So he turned on the gas under that and proceeded to let that cook away. And after a while then, after about an hour, when that would have been boiled and turned down and was simmering, he went out to the shop, and any rashers that had got sticky over the weekend, and they could have been sliced a week and they hadn't sold, they went into the pot. Sausages that were about to, you'd know by the smell of them, I grew to know these things later on. You'd always know when they were on the point of where they were gone bad, as different from being fresh and a few days old, and they went into the pot. There might have been a little joint of bacon that was gone a bit sticky, so that would be washed, diced up, and that went into the pot. Then the potatoes that had the stalks on them or whatever were peeled, they went into the pot. So what we had at the end of the day was a lovely big pot of coddle. Now, in today's world, people would vomit if they had to eat this, but I can tell you, it was one of the most delicious things you ever tasted. And every day, during the day, Hughie, Christy, myself and Art would have our dinner. A lovely man called Joe Eustace, who only died a couple of months ago. And Joe lived out in British where Arthur lived. And he had come to work. He was a year older than me, maybe 2, but no more than that. He had gone to work in Gorban's at Wexford Street, a carpet shop, to serve his time as a carpet fitter. But he turned out he was a better salesman than a fitter. And he ended up as a salesman in the shop. But he used to come every day for his dinner. And other people would arrive in, just random people off the street, who get the smell of the stuff cooking, and they'd want a bit of it, and they all got a bit of it. So then at the end of the day, whatever was left in the pot was the stock for the next day, and you started off the same routine the next day, gathering up the vegetables and whatever, all went into the pot. And the other pot then, which was the most unbelievable thing going, when we finished putting on the vegetables, Arthur opened this tea chest. There was a breadboard sitting on top of a tea chest, and I could get an odour of something that wasn't right, but this was my first day and I didn't really know what it was. But when he took the lid off the pot, off this tea chest, there was about 15 or 20 chickens in it. Now, you go into a shop today and you buy a chicken all done up and ready to put in the oven and all the rest of it. These chickens had the head and the feet on them, and they hadn't been cleaned out. And I'd never in my life done anything like this. So he cleaned the chicken out in front of me. Now, I have a very strong stomach, so it didn't bother me. But if you had a weak stomach, you would have threw up when you saw what was dragged out of the chicken. And as I said, it was a very innocent little boy. So he cleaned out a chicken and he cleaned out a second one. Now he says, see, can you do one? So I had watched what he was doing, and he washed his hands and went out of the shop and left me to clean the chicken. And the first chicken I pulled up, I took the head off it and pulled the skin up. I cut its neck off from the neck where it met the breast, and you pull up the skin and then you chop the head off, so you have a chicken's neck. That went into the pot. This is the pot now, the separate pot. You chopped off the feet, and then you stuck the knife into what would have been the belly of the chicken, cut it open and put your hand in and pulled out all the guts. And in the guts there would be the liver. And there was a little bag on the liver, like a little green bag, and this was the boil. And if that burst, you couldn't use the liver. But Arthur used to price these little chicken livers, because he'd fry them or they go into the pot, but most of the time he'd save them and fry them. The giblet in the inside of the chicken's gizzard, that had to be cut open, and it would be full of stones and bits of grit. That had to be cleaned out, and that went into the pot. So the first thing I found when I opened the chicken and pulled it out was an actual egg. Now, my eyes nearly popped out of my head, because other than the new chickens laid eggs, I couldn't conceive of one inside in the chicken in my imagination. But here was one in my hand, and I ran out to Arthur all excited. Look, Arthur, I'm at the finding this in the chicken. What'll I do with it? He says, crack it, he says, and throw it in on top of the cattle pot. Oh, dear God. So that pot held about 15 of these chickens, maybe more, but say 15 of these chickens. That these weren't little fancy little chickens like you see nowadays. These were called boiling hens, and you'd have to boil them for about 2.5 hours. And I filled up the pot anyway. Now he says, can the lid fit on it? And I said, yes, but it's sticking up a bit. That's grand, he says. So we went over, and there was a door out to this storeroom at the back of the shop, and there was a half a stone weight, and there was a stone weight. Now he says, lift that half stone weight and put that on top of the pot and see this keep the lid down. So it did. Now he said, that's grand, you've done a grand job. So as I was cleaning the guts up, they were all piling up on this table. So he says, when you've all the chickens taken out of the tea chest, just throw them back into that. Somebody will collect that later and take it away, who used to boil the guts for pigs, I believe. And all the bits of potato or the bits that weren't used, that all went into this for somebody to collect for to make the pigs well. So that was my introduction to Arthur's. And I had my bike with me, and at lunchtime I got an hour to my lunch, and I cycled home from Thomas Street to the ranch, had me dinner, and when I say a dinner, I ate a dinner, and cycled back, and I'd be back just within the hour. And by the time I got back to the shop, I'd be starving again. I had a ferocious appetite when I was a young fella. So the afternoon then, or the later part of the morning, would be spent preparing orders for people who lived out where Arthur lived in British, at the back of the British Inn pub. He had a little cottage out there. And at that time now, British, it's still to this day, it's not very built up. It's just beyond that famous pub, the Embankment. It's a little bit up the road from the Embankment. And Arthur used to supply a lot of the houses out there because there was one little local shop, a post office, but they wouldn't have sold bacon and chickens and stuff that Arthur sold. But he got to know all the farmers from living out there, and we would make up on an average day about 15 boxes of groceries and whatever they wanted. And he would deliver them in the afternoon. So in the afternoon then, Christy and Hughie and I scrubbed the shop and had it spotless. And I can honestly say, now in the meantime, they'd be giving out about Arthur when he was gone, that he's a sloppy so-and-so and all the rest of her doing things this way and that way. But we would scrub the shop and have it spotless and everything laid out the way it should be laid out. Fresh sawdust on the floor and everything covered over in the evening. The stuff taken out of the window, put into a fridge, which was a big cold room. I'd say its interior was about 7 foot tall, about 4 feet deep and about 4 feet square, and there was shelves in it so you could put your trays of stuff in it. And one of my jobs was on a Saturday I had to take everything out of that fridge, scrub the fridge with Vim and rinse it out and leave it clean and clean the trays and put them back into it. So everything going into it from Saturday night could be taken out nice and neat on Monday morning. But anyway, the shop would be clean. So the next day, the Tuesday when I went into work, I couldn't wait to get up out of bed. I thought it was great. And I arrived in, and I'd say within an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So from about 8 o'clock to 9:30, we were again topping up the pot for the dinner and topping up the pot for the chickens. And I forgot to say, the previous day when the chickens were cooked, I had to test them a couple of times. And he says, when you stick the fork into the chicken, if it moves, if you can kind of tear the flesh, the chicken was cooked. But I had to bring him out one on a plate to show him, and he said, that's done perfect. And as he was saying it, he was breaking off the leg and eating it. He was an awful man for eating. Now, he wasn't fat, he was portly, but he always looked immaculate in the suits and all that. But everything that he cooked, he had to try. If he made up the biscuit display, he ate one or two of them to see were they all right. And no matter what it was, he was cooking or preparing, he sampled it. So I'd say within an hour of him being in the shop the next day, it was like a pigsty again. So I spent my days running around after him, tidying up to stop Christy from fighting with him, or Christy would go out the back and he'd be slicing away on the rashers. And it was like watching a master craftsman, looking at him boning out sides of bacon, cutting it up and slicing the rashers on the machine, which in time I learned how to do. And Hughie, who was an excellent bacon man, he showed me all the little tricks of the trade, how to bone. At that time we used to take the ribs out individually, and he could take out a rib and there wouldn't be so much as a screed of meat on that rib when he would take it out. Nowadays the sheets are cut out in sheets, so you can go into shops and buy your sheets of bacon ribs and you pay a huge price for it. But in them days they were taken out individually. And he showed me how to cut up a ham and tie it and cut it into joints so it would look lovely in the window. So I loved working there. After a couple of weeks I had really fallen in love with the place. And the customers, the people, where I lived in the ranch, and I loved all the people in the ranch, but these people were Liberty people and they were a different breed of people altogether. A lot of them were rough and ready. They probably, to my ear, used a lot of bad language, but it really wasn't. It was just earthy language, and the one thing they were always up for was a bit of crack. And Arthur was the man to have the crack. As I said earlier, to him, life, it was like performing on the stage. 2 or 3 people that would come in every morning would come in, and Arthur would start singing a song, say the Chattanooga Shoe Shine Boy, and he'd have them joining in with him. And when I was potting around the shop, I'd be singing, and whatever the hit song was at the time, I don't know what it was, but he'd be getting me to start that, and I'd be shy at the time now. I wouldn't be wanting to sing in front of people or anything like that. Come on, he said, you're in show business. Come on, you'll get onto the stage before you're older. He says, sing the song. So we'd have a sing song, or we'd be telling the joke, and we'd be falling around the place laughing. And this was the day. It was a wonderful, wonderful place to work. So out on the street, outside the shop, we used to put out a table with vegetables on it, and every morning then Hughie would clean the window and get whitewash and mix up a little bit of whitewash in a jar, in a jam jar, and with a small paintbrush then he'd paint deals for the day on the window or whatever, and they would be changed every couple of days. But at that time on Thomas Street, from Corn Market up to St. Catherine's Church, there were dealers selling all along the street, and they sold everything under the sun, mainly vegetables and fruit. But then at different times of the year, at Easter they might have Easter eggs, or Christmas they'd have wrapping paper and all that kind of stuff. There were two ladies down the end of the street who specialised in fish, Sarah May and Teresa Fox, two wonderful characters. And when I started in Arthur's, one of my chores was to go out every day, and if the people in the country who ordered apples or oranges or bananas or cabbage or whatever, I would be sent out to the dealers to get it. And over a few months I got to know a good lot of them. So anyway, to make a long story short, Arthur would go off in the early afternoon to deliver his orders, and these were all out to places, Callaghanstown, Tooten Hill in Rathcoole, but that's up the mountain part of Rathcoole, Spring and Bank and Segerta. These were all country places at the time, they're not so much now. Even out as far as Pleasanton he used to deliver, and places in between. Newcastle, which was like the country at the time, he used to deliver, and I was 13 now at this stage, and he used to give me the keys of his van or the car, and it was like sitting in, I can only describe it to a young fella my age, it was like sitting in a tank. It was a big heavy car, and I didn't know how to drive, but I knew how to work a clutch and a gear stick from my grandfather had cars in his back garden, old bangers of things, and we learned how to do that. So I put the key in, I put the gear stick into neutral, start the engine, put the car into first gear, and very gently move the car forward a foot and reverse it a foot, just to amuse myself. So after a while, Arthur noticed I was doing this. So it wasn't the first Christmas I was working there, it was the second Christmas. He used to go to the market to buy turkeys over beside the Daisy Market. They had a market that sold poultry and fish, and he used to go and buy turkeys. So the second Christmas I was working there, I was 14, he brought me with him. And my job was to sit in the car and mind it while he was in buying the turkeys. Then he would get a fellow with a bogey to put the turkeys on in crates, wheel them out, we put them into the back of the car and drive over to the shop. And this would be about 5:30 in the morning. He would pick me up at my house. So the first day I went with him, I was sitting in the car when he had parked across an entrance into the market, and I was sitting in the passenger street saying to myself, it's not very cold, like this is a Christmas week, and it was quite mild. And I was remarking this to myself when all of a sudden this fella banged on the window, get that fucking car out of there, he says, you're blocking the entrance. So I didn't know what to do. If I got out of the car and left it, Arthur would have at me. So I jumped into the driver's seat and I put the car into first gear, and I gently took off and I drove right around the market back to where Arthur had left me, and the lorry that I was blocking had gone into the market. So I said nothing, I turned off the engine, got into the passenger seat, and Arthur arrived a few minutes later with the trays of turkeys. And he said, "That's grand." He said, "You're doing a great job minding the car." So I was afraid to tell him I'd driven it around the market. But on the way back to the shop, I told him, and I don't know whether he thought I was telling him lies or not. He said, "That's grand." He says, "I'll have you driving in no time." So I was 14 then, so later on that year, he took me out a couple of days with him to help deliver the orders. And this was fascinating because I was going into places, farmyards, meeting people that had the oddest accents and the way of talking that I ever heard in my life. These lovely country people, lovely, lovely people. And all they wanted to do was feed me. One of the first houses we went into, we arrived around what would have been their dinner time. This was in the early afternoon. And this lady, Mrs. Dunn, we used to call her Dirty Mrs. Dunn, and it's not because she was dirty, she wasn't, but she always wrote on white paper her list, and there were fingerprints always. It was obviously from newsprint. There was always fingerprints on the paper, so she became known as Mrs. Dirty Dunn, and this was her order. She got it on a Monday. And when we went in, she was preparing the table for the dinner. Now her husband they had a little small farm. She had a few children. They were sitting at a fire, and she spread out this newspaper on the table, and she took a pot of potatoes off a range, and she tipped them onto the table, just out into the middle of the table in a ball. And with that, her husband, a big countryman, walked in the door. All talked to Arthur. They all loved Arthur. They thought it was great crack. And Arthur introduced me to him, and he shook hands with me. His hand was like a shovel. And he says to Arthur, "Sit down there," he says, "and have a bit of dinner with us." So Arthur wanted to get out to deliver the rest of the orders, but they weren't having any of it. So we sat down, and I have to say, honestly say, two of the nicest potatoes I ever ate in my life, that they had grown, still in their skins, and they were delicious with country butter on them. Absolutely delicious. So we went around, I'd say we delivered about 10 orders that day, but that one stuck in my mind because of the food. But every house we went into, especially the women, they all wanted Arthur to sit down and have a cup of tea and a slice of cake and whatever. But he kept saying, "Oh, I have to get this child back to his mother," and all this crack. So we done this for a few weeks, and what I didn't know was I think it was in September, Arthur used to go to the Listowel races. It could have been August or September. And he never had anybody to deliver the orders. Now, I was still too young to drive, but he showed me where all the people lived, and then he eventually got a man who was a lovely man called Liam Norton. He was a salesman for Lipton's Tea, and a very handsome, debonair man, and always immaculately dressed. So he got Liam to come every day for the week he was away. It could have been the Galway races, actually, he was at. I think it was the Galway races, because I think Listowel was later on in the year. So I had to bring Liam out and show him where these places were. Now, Liam couldn't do the orders till after he finished work in the evening, where we had been going out earlier in the day. But anyway, we had a route written out, and we completed the route. And the last stop was a farm belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Kelly on a place called Tallahill. Now, Tallahill is, if you leave Talla and drive up past Ballinascorney and you come round the crest of a hill, and there's a stone cross just around the crest of the hill, and if you take that turn, it brings you right up into the heart of the mountains, and you end up where the army range is. If you take the next turn on the left, you drive up this mountain, over the top of it, and down the other side, and you end up in British, where Arthur lived. That hill is Tallahill. And this farmhouse, there was a family in it called Kelly's. And Mr. Kelly used to come into our shop every week and order stuff from Arthur. And he'd pay him for what he got the week before. And sometimes he brought his wife, and sometimes he didn't. But when he would come into the shop, he'd say to Christy, "Christy, are we breaking camp?" And that was the signal for Christy and him to go down to Redmond's pub, or Rogers pub, just down the road. And they'd have one pint. And Mr. Kelly would come back then. He would have gotten the bus into town, and then Arthur would bring him home. But anyway, we arrived at their house and knocked on the door. When they opened the door, there was no electricity in it. There were candles lighting, and there was a lovely fire as part of a range. And Mrs. Kelly invited us in. Her husband was sitting the other side of the fire, reading the paper by firelight, and I was full of the business. I went in and says, "Now, Mrs. Kelly, we've all your messages here. Put them on the table, Noel," she says, "they'll be grand." And with that, I nearly jumped out of my skin. This head appeared up, as I thought, out of the floor. I thought it was somebody coming up out of a grave. What I didn't know was they were these fit-up beds that people used to have. And in country, these cottages were quite small. And they had these fit-up beds, and they were beds made of straw, a wooden frame, and they just had a straw filling in them. And the two lads that lived in the house, Patsy and Johnny, slept. Actually, there was three boys lived in the house. There was Patsy, Johnny, and Billy. Billy was the local postman, and some character this guy was. But the head that came up out of the bed was Patsy, and Patsy's nickname was Giddy Up a Ding Dong, because every time he went to speak to you, that's what he used to say: "Giddy up a ding dong, how's it going, Noel?" That type of thing. So I got the fright in my life anyway, and they all thought this was hilarious. So I learned about fit-up beds that night. Johnny was the eldest son, Billy was the second son, and Patsy was the third son. They also had a sister, I think one sister, and the mother and father. Billy was the local postman, and he used to cycle. He had a bike, he used to cycle everywhere. He ended up eventually doing 2 or 3 runs out that area, and they gave him a little van. But at this time he had a bike. And Billy was always very careful with his money. And maybe every 6 weeks or 7 weeks, Arthur would arrive in with one shoe, a left foot or a right foot, a black shoe. And he'd send me around to Bonzi's shoe repair shop in Meath Street to have the shoe repaired. Mainly it was the sole was gone in it. And it turned out this belonged to Billy the postman. And he wouldn't get the 2 shoes repaired together. One would come in, and then 6 or 7 weeks later, the other shoe would come in. And this was great crack. I thought this was fantastic. But anyway, we all got on great. So eventually, when I turned 16, 17, Arthur used to let me drive his car. And when he would go away then on his holidays, I got to do the orders. And this was one of my joys in life, was to drive out to these lovely, lovely people and meet them. And I used to come home stuffed because I ate it and they gave me. So one of the men, I can't remember what farmer it was, but he was bald. And every so often, Arthur would send me around to Mushat's Chemist in Francis Street, which, as everybody knows, they used to make up concoctions, the likes of which nobody had the recipes for. No matter what was wrong with you, they had a cure for it. But they had this cure for baldness, allegedly. And it was a bottle of liquid. And every so often, Arthur would get one for this man out in British. And he would rub it into his head. His hair never grew. To my knowledge, it never grew, but he kept getting it. But after a while, I copped on to the fact that the Mr. Mushat who was selling me this mixture, he was as bald as an egg. He had a big bald head like an egg. And one of their biggest sellers was this hair restorer. So make what you can out of that. But they made fantastic hot bottles. They made their own soap, and to this day you can still buy it in Meath Street. And this is 50, nearly 60 years later. The recipes are still going strong. They make a fantastic soap that is great for dermatitis. The hot bottles are legendary, and that's only 2 of the things that Foley's make up. But anyway, that was it. So I'm going to finish now, but I'll come back to this again, and I'll add to it because I think you've heard enough for now, and I don't want to bore you. So God bless, and I'll talk to you soon.